She waited in the church, but the groom never showed up. What no one knew was that a mysterious man was there, watching everything from the last row, and what he did surprised everyone. Where are you watching this story from? Subscribe to the channel and leave a like because the ending will move you. The lace veil from Charleston trembled in the wind when Winifred understood that he would not come. There, before 200 guests in the small chapel, perched on the cliffs of Cape Cod, with the scent of beach roses mingling with the salty breeze coming from the Atlantic, the bride clutched her bouquet of white peonies while her mother whispered words she couldn't process. The organist had played the wedding march 3 times. The minister looked at his watch with growing discomfort, and the groom had simply vanished. The midday sun filtered through the antique stained glass windows, casting patches of crimson and gold color on the stone floor worn by centuries of footsteps. Winifred could hear the growing murmur of the guests, the nervous rustle of silk dresses, her father's embarrassed throat clearing at the entrance. Each passing second was an eternity, each heartbeat a drum announcing the deepest humiliation of her life. There are moments when fate slams a door with such violence that the echo resonates for years, but only so we can hear the gentle call of another door opening in the distance. What no one knew at that moment was that seated in the last row of the chapel, a man in a grey suit observed everything with an expression mixing compassion and something deeper, something even he couldn't yet name. Thaddeus had arrived in the coastal town barely 2 days earlier to evaluate the purchase of a historic estate downtown, but something had led him to that small chapel that Saturday morning. His eyes, the color of dark amber, didn't leave the bride's face. Not out of morbid curiosity, but because he recognized in her something he had seen in the mirror for years, dignity held by invisible threads, the superhuman effort not to collapse when the whole world watches. When finally Winifred's mother took her by the arm and led her toward the vestry amid compassionate whispers and pitying glances, Thaddeus remained seated. The guests began to disperse, some indignant, others gossiping in low voices, most simply uncomfortable before the unfolding drama. He waited until the chapel was nearly empty, until only the beach roses decorated the empty altar and the echo of promises never spoken. He stood slowly, adjusted his Italian silk tie and walked toward the exit. But before leaving, he left on the guest book a note written in firm handwriting. True strength lies not in avoiding falls, but in rising with grace when everyone expects to see you broken. Winifred would find that note 3 weeks later, when she finally had the courage to return to the chapel to retrieve her belongings. By then, she would have already passed through the initial stages of grief, the denial that kept her awake through entire nights, waiting for a call that never came, the anger that made her destroy every photograph of the 5 years shared, the sadness that forced her to close the bakery for a full week for the first time in her life. Winifred was known throughout Cape Cod for her magical hands in baking. Her apple pies were so famous that people reserved months in advance. Her wedding cakes looked like sculptures of buttercream and meringue, so beautiful that some clients hesitated to cut them. She had learned the craft from her grandmother, a small woman with an iron character who had transmitted not only recipes, but a life philosophy. Sweet girl, dough reveals who you are. If you're rushed or angry, it shows. If you work with love and patience, every bite tells a story. Every Monday, without fail, Winifred donated leftover pastries to the nursing home in town. She knew each customer by name, remembered their birthdays, their preferences, their children's allergies. She was the type of woman who rose at 4 in the morning to prepare croissants, who left handwritten notes in each pastry box, who kept her grandmother's recipes in a notebook stained with flour and love. But behind that facade of resilient sweetness, a deep fear began to settle after that day. Never again would she be able to trust someone. Thaddeus, for his part, returned to the inn he had temporarily rented on the outskirts of town. The room overlooked a New England courtyard with ancient cobblestones and a stone fountain that murmured constantly. He removed his jacket, poured himself a bourbon, and sat on the balcony to watch the sunset paint the mountains surrounding the village orange and purple. He wasn't a man given to impulsive emotions. He had built his empire stone by stone, investment after investment, with the patience of one who knows the value of time. His chain of boutique hotels specialized in rescuing historic buildings, forgotten mansions, abandoned estates, and transforming them into spaces that celebrated colonial architecture and regional American culture. It wasn't simply a lucrative business. It was his way of creating something he never had, a home, because Thaddeus had grown up in foster homes in Vermont, passing from one temporary family to another, from one institution to another, never truly belonging anywhere. Each hotel he opened was an attempt to create spaces where other people could feel what had been denied him: belonging, warmth, roots. That evening, as stars began to appear over the Atlantic, he made a decision. He wouldn't abandon this town until completing not only the purchase of the estate, but other properties he had identified. And somehow he didn't yet fully understand. He knew the woman in the wedding dress with broken eyes was part of that equation. Over the following 18 months, a story would unfold in ways none of those present in that chapel could have imagined. The bell above the bakery door chimed softly when Thaddeus entered for the first time. The aroma hit him like a wave. Cinnamon mixed with vanilla, brown sugar intertwined with butter, the sweet scent of caramelizing sugar in some invisible corner. It was like entering an embrace made of memories and promises. Winifred was behind the counter, decorating a children's birthday cake. Her hands moved with mechanical precision, creating pink buttercream flowers, while her eyes, still swollen from crying so much, remained fixed on her work. She wore her hair pulled back in a messy bun, and her white apron showed stains of food coloring and chocolate. When she looked up and saw him, something in her expression wavered. He wasn't a regular customer, that was evident. His suit, though informal by his standards, was too refined for this coastal town. His Italian shoes resonated with a different sound on the antique tiles. "Good morning," Thaddeus said with a voice softer than she expected. "I tried your chocolate chip cookies at last month's charity fair. I'd never tasted anything so delicious." She blinked, bewildered. She didn't remember him from the fair, but they had been chaotic days, hundreds of people passing by her booth. "How many would you like?" "Half a dozen artisanal cookies." He paused, observing the display cases full of temptations. "And perhaps you could recommend something else. I'm exploring the region." Winifred mechanically pointed to several pastries: the lemon meringue tartlets, the cinnamon rolls she had perfected after years of experiments, the mini pecan pies. As she did, Thaddeus watched her with attention that made her nervous. "Are you new to town?" she asked while packing the pastries in a box with her logo. "Temporary," he replied. "I'm evaluating some properties for a project." "What kind of project?" "Boutique hotels. I rescue historic buildings and transform them into spaces that celebrate local culture." For the first time since he'd entered, something like genuine interest crossed Winifred's face. "There are several abandoned estates on the outskirts. Most haven't been inhabited for decades." "I know," Thaddeus smiled slightly. "In fact, I've already identified 3 that could work perfectly." When he went to pay, he left a bill much higher than necessary, and before she could protest, said, "The change is for the nursing home. I was told you donate pastries every week." Winifred remained paralyzed, her mouth slightly open. "Who told you that?" "In small towns, good deeds echo," he replied simply, taking the box. "Thank you for the pastries, I'll be back." And he kept his word. During the following 2 weeks, Thaddeus appeared at the bakery every 2 days, always buying different pastries, always leaving generous tips, always with some kind comment, but never intrusive. He didn't mention the wedding. He didn't ask personal questions. He was simply there, a constant, but not overwhelming presence. Winifred began to wait for him, without realizing it. She prepared certain pastries she knew he preferred, saved the best cinnamon rolls for his visits, and though they didn't talk much, there was growing comfort in those brief exchanges. It was during his 6th visit that he finally revealed the first significant information. "I've completed the purchase of the Harrington estate," he said, while she handed him a box of cookies. "I've also acquired the old colonial mansion with gardens on Main Street." Winifred looked up sharply. "The Bradford Mansion? But that building has been in the Bradford family for generations." "Not anymore." Thaddeus looked at her directly. "They're facing financial difficulties. They preferred to sell it to someone who would preserve it rather than see it fall into the hands of developers who would convert it into modern condos." She nodded slowly, processing the information. The Bradford Mansion was an 18th century architectural gem, with original woodwork and a garden of century-old oaks. "And what will you do with it?" "A hotel that tells the story of this Cape Cod region Each room decorated with local elements, every corner breathing history, he paused. But I need more than architecture. I need the place to have a soul. A soul? Food that tells stories. Pastries that preserve memories. Gastronomy is the heart of any culture. Winifred felt something stir in her chest, something that had been asleep since that horrible day at the chapel. Are you offering me a job? Not yet, Thaddeus replied honestly. First, I need to know if you'd be interested in such a project. It's not just making pastries for a hotel. It's creating a dessert menu that narrates the culinary history of this land, from colonial times to today. She remained silent, her hands resting on the marble counter her grandmother had installed decades ago. I need to think about it. Of course, he nodded. There's no rush. But there was rush. Because that very afternoon, Winifred's landlord appeared at the bakery with news that left her breathless. The building where her business operated had just been sold to an investment group, and the new owner hadn't yet confirmed whether they would renew the lease contracts. When Thaddeus returned 2 days later, he found the bakery closed. A sign in the window said, "Temporarily closed for personal reasons." But he knew the truth. Because the investment group that had bought the building wasn't a group, it was one of his companies, purchased through a network of properties he had been strategically acquiring for months. And now, Winifred could lose her bakery. Night was falling over the town when Winifred finally opened the certified letter. Her hands trembled as she read the formal words, the legal language that basically said she had 60 days to vacate the premises or negotiate a new contract with terms not yet specified. 60 days to dismantle what she had built for 7 years. 60 days to pack up her grandmother's dreams, the recipes worth more than any money, the community she had created around that small bakery on Harbour Street. She dropped into the chair behind the counter, the letter still in her hands, and for the first time in weeks allowed tears to flow freely. They weren't just tears for the shop, they were tears for everything, for the fiancé who had abandoned her, for the public humiliation, for the growing feeling that her life was crumbling piece by piece, and she couldn't do anything to stop it. Sometimes life doesn't take things from us all at once, but tears them away little by little, like someone plucking a rose petal by petal, so we feel each loss with painful clarity. The phone's ring startled her. It was her mother. "Sweetheart, did you open the letter?" "Yes, Mom. We need to talk. Your father and I—" Her mother's voice broke. "There's something we should have told you months ago." Half an hour later, Winifred sat in the kitchen of the family home, listening to her parents confess something that left her even more devastated. Her father's hardware store had been losing money for almost 2 years. They had taken a loan using the house as collateral. They were on the verge of bankruptcy. "Why didn't you tell me anything?" Winifred asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We didn't want to ruin your wedding," her father replied, hands trembling on the table. "We thought we could solve it, that the economy would improve, that—" "How much do you owe?" When her father mentioned the figure, Winifred felt the floor open beneath her feet. It was more than she would earn in 5 years working at the bakery. "We'll go to the bank tomorrow," her father continued. "We'll negotiate a payment plan. Maybe we'll sell the beach house we inherited from your uncle." "No," Winifred stood abruptly. "That house is the only asset you have. You won't sell it." But as she drove back to her apartment that night, Winifred's mind was a whirlwind. Not only was she facing the loss of her business, but now she discovered her family was in financial crisis. And worst of all was the question beginning to form in her mind. Had her ex-fiancé known about these problems? Was that the real reason he had fled? The answer came in the most unexpected way. 3 days later, while Winifred desperately tried to calculate how long she could keep the bakery open without renewing the contract, her ex-sister-in-law appeared at the door. Penelope, the younger sister of the man who had abandoned her, had red eyes from crying. "You need to know the truth," Penelope said, without preliminary greetings. "My brother didn't just run because of gambling debts." Winifred invited her in. They sat in the back room, surrounded by the aroma of cinnamon and vanilla filtering from the oven. "He knew about your grandmother's recipe," Penelope continued. "The imperial apple pie. The recipe that won the national award in 1987. "That very one," Penelope lowered her voice. "There are collectors who pay fortunes for documented historic recipes. A buyer from Boston offered him $100,000 for it. The plan was to marry you, legally inherit the recipe through matrimonial rights, and sell it. Winifred felt the world stop. The imperial apple pie wasn't just a recipe. It was her grandmother's legacy, documented in a notebook dating from 1823, passed from generation to generation with annotations from each woman in the family. It was living history, tangible culture, love materialized in flour and sugar. But then he discovered your father's debts, Penelope continued. He realized you didn't have money to rescue him from his creditors, so he fled before things got more complicated. He used me, Winifred whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. He used you, Penelope confirmed, tears rolling down her cheeks. And I'm so sorry. I tried to warn you, but he made me swear to silence. He said if I spoke, he'd destroy our family. But I can't keep quiet anymore. You deserve to know why he abandoned you. After Penelope left, Winifred remained alone in the empty bakery. Her grandmother's notebook was kept in the safe, along with the few valuable items she possessed. She pulled it out with trembling hands, turned the yellowed pages full of ancient handwriting, ingredient stains and marginal notes written by women she had loved but never known. The true value of things is never in their price, but in the hands that created them, and in the hearts that preserved them. That night she made a decision. She wouldn't sell the recipe. No matter how many offers she received, how much she needed the money. Some things were priceless because they didn't belong to the market. They belonged to the soul. But she still needed to save the bakery and help her parents. And the only person who seemed to have a solution was precisely the man who now owned the building where she worked, Thaddeus. Finding Thaddeus was easier than Winifred had anticipated. He was supervising renovations at the Bradford mansion when she arrived, covered in construction dust with architectural blueprints, spread on an improvised table in the courtyard. "Winifred," he said, surprised but clearly pleased to see her. "I wasn't expecting—" "I need to talk to you," she interrupted, her voice firmer than she felt, "about my bakery building." Thaddeus gestured to the workers to take a break and guided her to a quieter area under a century-old oak that perfumed the air. "I know your company bought the building," Winifred began. "I need to know what your plans are. If you're going to raise the rent, if you're going to renovate, we should discuss this in my office," he interrupted gently. "With all the necessary documentation." "I don't want a formal meeting," she replied brusquely. "I want an honest answer. Are you going to take my bakery away?" Thaddeus looked at her for a long moment. The midday sun filtered through the oak leaves, creating patterns of light and shadow on their faces. "I don't want to take anything from you," he said finally, "but I do need that space to be part of something bigger. I'm developing a culinary center that celebrates the flavors of New England. Your bakery could be the heart of that project." "What does that mean exactly?" "It means partnership. Not as an employee, but as a partner. We'd renovate the space, expand it, connect it to an artisanal baking school. We'd preserve traditional recipes while innovating. And you'd lead all of it." Winifred felt her heart beat hard. "Why me?" "Because in 2 weeks of buying your pastries, I've learned something many entrepreneurs forget. The soul of a place doesn't come from investment, it comes from the people who love it. And you love what you do in a way that can't be faked." "I don't have capital to invest," she said, forcing herself to be practical. "My family is facing financial difficulties. I can't be a partner in anything." "I don't need your money," Thaddeus replied. "I need your knowledge, your passion, your connection to this community. That's worth much more than any monetary investment." Winifred wanted to believe it. God, how she wanted to believe it. But she had been deceived before, used by someone who pretended to love her while planning to steal what was most precious to her. "I need time to think about it." "Take all the time you need," Thaddeus said. "But Winifred, there's something else you should know." She waited, tense. "The competition has already arrived. There's a company from New York proposing to create a similar center with bigger investment and shorter timelines. Municipal officials are interested. If we don't act quickly, we'll lose the opportunity." "Are you pressuring me?" "I'm being honest with you," he corrected. "The reality is this project will happen, with or without us. I'd prefer it to be with someone who genuinely loves this land and its traditions, but I can't force you." That night, Winifred called a family meeting. She needed advice. She needed perspective. She needed something more than the voice in her head, alternating between hope and terror. Her father listened carefully while she explained Thaddeus's proposal. Her mother asked practical questions about contracts and percentages. Her younger sister, Beatrice, who was studying law at university, took notes. "It sounds too good to be true," her mother finally said. "Men with money always have hidden agendas." "Not all men are like Gregory," Beatrice defended. "Besides, I've researched Thaddeus Whitmore. His company has an impeccable reputation. Every hotel he's opened has revitalized communities, preserved cultural heritage." "But why here?" her mother insisted. "Why this town specifically?" It was a good question, one that Winifred had also asked herself. The answer came 2 days later, in the most unexpected way. Winifred was closing the bakery when she saw Thaddeus walking down Harbour Street, not in her direction, but apparently lost in his own thoughts. She watched him from the window, noticing details she hadn't caught before. The way he distractedly touched the old walls as he passed, how he stopped before each historic building as if reading an invisible story. Acting on impulse, she left the bakery. "Everything okay?" He turned, surprised to see her. "Just walking. This town has a special energy at twilight." "Why here?" she asked directly. "You could invest anywhere in America. Bigger places with more tourism, more immediate profitability." Thaddeus looked toward the hills darkening in the distance. "Do you know the feeling of searching for something your whole life without knowing exactly what it is?" She nodded slowly. "I grew up without roots," he continued. "I passed through 12 foster homes before turning 18. I never had a place I could call home. Every hotel I open is an attempt to create that for others, but also for myself. That doesn't explain why this town." He looked at her directly, and in his eyes there was a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. "Because I came here by chance 2 months ago for a simple property evaluation, and I stayed in the chapel during a wedding that never happened. I saw a woman maintain her dignity when everything was collapsing. And I thought, if she can be that strong on the worst day of her life, then this place has something worth preserving." Winifred felt the air leave her lungs. "You were there?" "At my wedding. I was invited by the minister, an old friend," Thaddeus admitted. "I didn't know anything about you or your situation, but what I saw that day and stayed with me." She didn't know what to say. All words seemed insufficient before that revelation. "I didn't make this investment decision because of you," he quickly clarified. "I made it because this place has real potential, but I won't pretend that seeing you face that situation with such grace didn't influence my desire to know this community better. There are encounters that aren't accidents, but intersection points where two souls' paths had to cross, though it takes time to understand why." Winifred walked toward the interior of her bakery, Thaddeus following in silence. She turned on the lights, revealing the space that had been her sanctuary for years. The walls decorated with photographs of satisfied customers, the shelves full of antique molds, the marble counter her grandmother had personally installed. "This bakery is my identity," she said softly. "I don't know who I am without it. And that terrifies me, because it means I've put all my worth in a place, in a business, not in myself." "I understand that fear," Thaddeus replied. "Better than you imagine." She turned toward him. "If I accept your proposal, what guarantees do I have that I won't end up losing everything again?" "None," he said honestly. "Businesses are risky, partnerships can fail, projects might not prosper. But what I can promise you is that every decision will be made with integrity, with respect for what you've built, and with the goal of preserving what makes this place special." Winifred breathed deeply. "Give me a week. I need to consult with a lawyer, review numbers, talk with my family." "Take 2 weeks if you need them," Thaddeus replied. "This is a long-term commitment. It has to feel right for both of us." When he left that night, Winifred remained alone in the bakery, surrounded by the tools of her trade and her grandmother's memories. She pulled out the old notebook, turned the pages until she found a note written by her great-grandmother in 1952. "Sometimes courage isn't taking big steps, but daring to take small ones when everything inside you screams to stay still." And for the first time in months, Winifred felt something like hope. The following week brought an earthquake that shook all carefully laid plans. A culinary company from New York, led by a businesswoman named Victoria Sterling, presented to the town council a dazzling proposal to create a cutting-edge culinary complex in the historic downtown. The plans were impressive. Ultra-modern design, cutting-edge technology, promises to attract Michelin star chefs and put the town on the international gastronomic map. What Victoria Sterling didn't initially mention was that her project required demolishing several historic buildings, including 2 estates from the 17th century. The news reached Winifred through the minister, who appeared at the bakery one morning with a local newspaper under his arm and a worried expression. "This could change the whole town," he said, unfolding the newspaper on the counter, "and not necessarily for the better." Winifred read the article with growing alarm. Sterling's project promised millions in investment, hundreds of jobs, a constant flow of wealthy tourists. On paper, it sounded like a dream come true for an economically depressed town. But the fine print revealed the cost, the destruction of the historic character that made the town unique, the conversion of an authentic place into a gastronomic theme park designed for tourists with more money than cultural appreciation. "What does Thaddeus say about this?" the minister asked. "I don't know. I haven't talked to him in days." But Thaddeus knew. In fact, he had been locked in meetings with architects and lawyers, crafting a counter-proposal that would preserve heritage while offering economic development. The problem was time. Sterling had political connections, ready investors, and a well-oiled public relations machine. That afternoon, while Winifred prepared a batch of cookies, Thaddeus entered the bakery with a leather briefcase and a serious expression. "I need your answer," he said without preamble. "The situation has changed." She left the dough she was kneading and wiped her hands on her apron. "I've seen Sterling's plans." "Then you know this is no longer just about a business project. It's about what kind of place we want this town to be." "We want," Winifred repeated. "You just arrived a few weeks ago. I was born here." "Exactly," he replied. "That's why your voice matters more than mine. I need you to tell me honestly, do you want to preserve this place or do you want to see it transformed into something completely different?" Winifred felt the weight of the question. It wasn't just about her bakery or her potential partnership with Thaddeus. It was about the essence of her community, about the streets where she had learned to ride a bike, about the squares where her grandmother had shared recipes with other women from town. "I want to preserve it," she said finally. "But I also need to be realistic. People need jobs, opportunities. We can't live on nostalgia alone." "I agree." Thaddeus opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "That's why I've crafted an alternative proposal that offers development without destruction. But to present it to the town council with credibility, I need local partners. I need the community to be behind this. And if they're not, then Sterling wins. And in 5 years, this town will be unrecognizable." Life's most important decisions rarely come with enough time to think them through, but demand we leap, even when we can't see where we'll land. Winifred took the folder, feeling its physical and metaphorical weight. "Give me 24 hours. That night she called an extraordinary meeting in the parish hall. She invited local merchants, artisans, teachers, small business owners. More than 50 people filled the space, all talking at once about the news that had shaken the town. Thaddeus presented his proposal with clarity and passion. He talked about rescuing buildings instead of demolishing them, creating a culinary school that would train local youth, a sustainable tourism model that would respect the place's authenticity. He showed financial projections, timelines, success cases from other hotels he had developed. But it was Winifred who changed the meeting's tone. She stood, still in her flour-stained apron, and spoke from the heart. "I lost something important a few months ago," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "And for weeks I thought that loss defined me. But I've learned something. What defines us isn't what we lose, but what we choose to preserve, and how we choose to rebuild." She paused, looking at the familiar faces around her. "This town gave us identity. It gave us stories, traditions, a sense of belonging. If we allow that to be destroyed by the promise of quick money, we'll be selling our soul, and no job, however well paid, can replace that." The words resonated in the silence that followed. Then, one by one, the merchants began to nod. The hardware store owner spoke about his 40 years in the family business. The teacher shared concerns about what kind of future they were creating for the children. The artisan carpenter expressed fear that his craft would become obsolete in a modernized town. When the vote finally took place, it was almost unanimous. The community would support Thaddeus's proposal over Sterling's. But the real battle was just beginning. Victoria Sterling wasn't the type of woman who accepted defeats easily. When she learned that the local community supported Thaddeus's proposal, she responded with an aggressive media campaign. Articles began appearing in regional newspapers questioning the financial viability of Thaddeus's project. Investors romanticizing the past while condemning the town to poverty, said one of the headlines. Cultural preservation or economic stagnation? Asked another. Winifred watched with growing frustration as the narrative began to change. People who had supported the project at the meeting now expressed doubts. The town's young people, especially, felt attracted to the promises of well-paying jobs Sterling offered. She's hiring a PR firm from Boston, Beatrice informed her, having investigated, and she's having private meetings with town council members, offering incentives that aren't exactly legal but are hard to prove. Thaddeus, for his part, maintained a calm that Winifred found both admirable and irritating. Truth always wins in the long run, he'd say, when she expressed frustration. But in the long run we'll all be dead, Winifred would reply. Or at least we'll have lost everything we're trying to preserve. The tension between them began to grow. Thaddeus wanted to handle things with diplomacy and patience. Winifred felt they needed to be more aggressive, more public with their message. You don't understand how this community works, she told him during a particularly heated discussion in the improvised office he had set up at the Bradford mansion. People here don't respond to PowerPoint presentations and financial projections. They respond to stories, to personal connections. And you think I don't know that? Thaddeus replied, his usual composure cracking. I've spent my entire adult life trying to create places that feel like home precisely because I never had one. Every hotel is an attempt to build that connection you take for granted. Winifred froze at that raw confession. I don't take anything for granted, she said softly. Not after everything I've lost. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I know. I'm sorry. I'm frustrated, and that's no excuse for... I have an idea, she interrupted him. But you'll need to trust me. Winifred's idea was simple but bold. A community culinary festival that would showcase exactly what would be lost if Sterling's project went forward. It wouldn't be an elegant, polished event, but an authentic celebration of local cuisine, with the town's grandmothers sharing century-old recipes, with fishermen grilling fresh seafood on the beach, with each family contributing a traditional dish. We'll invite journalists, food bloggers, cultural influencers, Winifred explained, but most importantly, we'll invite every town resident to participate. Not as audience, but as protagonists. Thaddeus looked at the plans she had sketched on bakery napkins. It's brilliant, he admitted, but it'll take weeks to organize something like this. We have 3 weeks before the town council votes on the proposals, she replied. It's enough if we all get to work. And they got to work. Winifred discovered she had a natural talent for organization and motivation. She visited every shop, every home, recruiting participants. Thaddeus used his contacts to attract media and secure municipal permits. But 2 days before the festival, disaster struck. An unexpected storm hit the coast, damaging much of the infrastructure they had set up in the main square. Destroyed tents, soaked cooking equipment, ruined decorations. The cost of replacing everything exceeded the tight budget they had raised. Winifred walked through the wreckage, feeling tears threaten to overflow. They had worked so hard, had put so much into this, and now everything seemed lost. It was Thaddeus who found a solution. We'll move the festival to several small locations simultaneously, he proposed. The Bradford Mansion courtyard, your bakery, the beach, the covered market. We'll have people walk through town discovering different culinary experiences at each corner. That's even more complicated to organize, Winifred objected. But it's more authentic, he argued. A festival concentrated in one square can be impressive, but this will be something people actually live, exploring the town like never before. He was right. And when the festival finally took place, it was magical in ways no amount of planning could have designed. The grandmothers set up cooking stations in their own homes, inviting strangers to enter and learn recipes they'd kept for decades. The fishermen organized a giant clam bake on the beach at sunset, telling stories of the sea while they cooked. Winifred transformed her bakery into a living museum of traditional baking, with tastings every hour and demonstrations of ancient techniques. More than 2,000 people attended throughout the day, including journalists from Boston and New York, food bloggers with hundreds of thousands of followers, and most importantly, town residents who had never truly valued what they had until they saw it celebrated this way. Victoria Sterling also attended, watching from a distance with an expression Winifred couldn't fully read. When the sun set over the Atlantic and the last notes of folk music faded into the salt air, Winifred found herself standing on the beach, exhausted but strangely at peace. Thaddeus approached, 2 glasses of local wine in his hands. "We did it," he said simply. "We did it," she repeated, accepting the glass. They toasted in silence, watching the waves glisten under the moonlight. "You know what's strangest about all this?" Winifred asked after a moment. 3 months ago I thought my life was over, and now I'm here having created something I never imagined possible. "The best stories begin when we believe everything is over," Thaddeus replied. "They're the endings that turn out to be new beginnings. True growth never happens in moments of tranquility, but in the chaotic spaces between what was and what we don't yet know can be." But even as they celebrated, both knew the hardest battle was still to come. The town council vote that would decide the town's future, and Victoria Sterling still had cards to play. The town council vote was scheduled for a week when Thaddeus received a call that would change everything. It was his financial director in Boston, with devastating news. One of his associated companies had collapsed unexpectedly, dragging with it significant investments Thaddeus had committed to the town project. The loss didn't just affect this specific project, but threatened the stability of his entire hotel chain. "How bad is it?" Thaddeus asked, his voice controlled despite the panic growing in his chest. "You need to return to Boston immediately," his director replied. "If we don't manage this correctly in the next few days, you could lose everything." Winifred knew something was wrong the moment she saw him enter the bakery that afternoon. His face, usually composed, showed lines of tension she hadn't seen before. What happened? He told her everything. The lost investment, the financial crisis threatening his other projects, the urgent need to return to Boston for damage control. "What does this mean for our project here?" she asked, though she feared the answer. "It means I won't be able to finance it on the terms I promised," Thaddeus admitted. "I'll need additional investors, which means less control, more compromises, or I'll have to drastically reduce the project's scope." Winifred felt the world tilt. "When are you leaving?" "Tomorrow morning. I'll try to resolve this as quickly as possible, but you might not come back," she finished. He didn't deny it, he couldn't. That night Winifred couldn't sleep. She lay awake in her apartment, staring at the ceiling and feeling history repeat itself in the cruelest way. Again, she was investing her trust in someone. Again, she was building dreams that now seemed as fragile as glass. Beatrice came to visit her the next day, finding her surrounded by papers and project documents. "What will you do?" her sister asked. "I don't know," Winifred admitted. "Part of me wants to give up, accept it was destined to fail from the beginning. But another part is furious." Winifred stood, walking to the window. "Furious because I believed in this, I believed in him, and now I might lose everything again." "Or maybe," Beatrice suggested gently, "this is your opportunity to prove you can do this without him." The words resonated in Winifred with unexpected force. She was right. For months she had been following Thaddeus's lead, supporting his vision, contributing but never truly taking the reins. That afternoon, Winifred called another community meeting. This time, she didn't invite Thaddeus. "Many of you have heard that our main investor is facing financial difficulties," she began, her voice firm despite the nervousness she felt. "Some might see this as a sign we should give up and accept Sterling's proposal." There were murmurs of agreement among the audience. "But I see it differently," Winifred continued. "I see it as an opportunity to prove this project never depended on a rich man with money from Boston. It depended on us, on our community, on our determination to preserve what we love." She unfolded a new plan, one she had been developing all night. Instead of depending on a main investor, they would create a cooperative. Each local business would contribute what it could, small amounts that together would be significant. They would seek government grants for cultural preservation. They would work with non-profit organizations dedicated to architectural heritage. "It won't be easy," Winifred admitted. "It'll take longer, require more sacrifice from each of us, but it'll be ours, truly ours." The response was mixed. Some were inspired by her passion, others were skeptical about practical viability. but enough people committed to make the plan seem possible. Meanwhile, in Boston, Thaddeus was fighting his own battle. Endless meetings with bankers, negotiations with investors, desperate attempts to save what he had built for years. Every evening he called Winifred, updating her on progress, or lack thereof. "How's the project going there?" he always asked. "Moving forward," she'd reply without giving details. He could feel the distance growing between them, not just physical but emotional. And it terrified him what that meant. A week before the town council vote, Victoria Sterling made her final move. She presented a revised proposal incorporating some cultural preservation elements while maintaining aggressive development. It was a hybrid designed to attract those on the fence, and it worked. Polls showed support for the cooperative-led project headed by Winifred was declining. It was then that Winifred received an unexpected call from the minister. "You need to know something," he said, "about Victoria Sterling and her connection to your ex-fiancé." What he revealed was shocking. Gregory, the man who had abandoned Winifred at the altar, had been working with Sterling since before the wedding. The idea had been for him to marry Winifred, gain access to the imperial apple pie recipe, then sell it to Sterling as part of her American Culinary Heritage collection for the project. When Gregory discovered Winifred's family debts and fled, Sterling simply changed tactics. Now she was trying to get recipes directly from the town, offering to buy documentation rights from local grandmothers for generous sums that represented a fraction of their real value. "She's trying to appropriate our culture," the minister said with indignation, "and convert it into her company's intellectual property." Winifred felt a cold fury settle in her stomach. This was no longer about business or economic development. It was about identity, dignity, not allowing the most sacred to be commodified and exploited. That night, she did something she hadn't done in months. She sought out her grandmother's notebook and read every page, every recipe, every marginal note. And at the end, she found something she had never seen before, a folded letter, yellowed by time, written by her grandmother shortly before dying. "Dear granddaughter," it said, "if you're reading this, it means you're facing a difficult decision about these recipes. I want you to know their value isn't in the money they could generate, but in the hands that prepared them and the hearts that shared them. Preserve that above all else. Preserve the generosity that turns food into love." Sometimes the past doesn't give us answers, but reminds us who we are when the present threatens to make us forget. With renewed determination, Winifred knew exactly what she had to do. The day of the vote dawned with grey skies threatening storm. Winifred woke with a knot in her stomach, knowing the odds were against her. The latest polls showed Victoria Sterling had the support of 4 of the 7 town council members. Thaddeus was still in Boston, trapped in negotiations determining the future of his entire company. He had called the night before, his voice tired but hopeful. "I think I've done it," he had said. "If I can close this deal tomorrow, I'll be able to save the investment for the project. I'll be able to come back." But tomorrow was today, the same day as the vote, and the odds he could return in time were practically nil. Winifred dressed carefully, choosing a simple but elegant dress her grandmother had given her years ago. She pulled back her hair, and for the first time in months allowed herself to truly look in the mirror. The woman looking back was different from the abandoned bride of months ago. There was pain in her eyes, yes, but also something else. Strength, determination, a kind of grace that comes only from having survived the worst and discovering you're still standing. The town hall was packed when she arrived. More than 200 people had gathered, clearly divided into 2 camps. Sterling's supporters, mostly young people and entrepreneurs who saw the promise of economic prosperity. The community project supporters, mainly long-time residents who valued tradition. Victoria Sterling arrived with a team of advisors, all in impeccable suits with prepared digital presentations. Winifred arrived with Beatrice, carrying a box of documents and proposals. "Are you ready?" her sister asked. "No," Winifred admitted, "but I'll do it anyway." Sterling's presentation was impressive. Economic growth projections, dazzling architectural renderings, testimonials from tourism development experts. She promised jobs, improved infrastructure, putting the town on the world gastronomic map. When it was Winifred's turn, she stood before the council with only an old notebook and her voice. "I can't compete with elegant presentations or promises of wealth," she began. I don't have computer renderings or market studies from international firms. What I have is this. She held up her grandmother's notebook. This is a record of recipes that have passed through 5 generations of women in my family. But it's not just my family. Every family in this town has something similar. Stories, traditions, knowledge that can't be quantified in growth projections. She opened the notebook to a marked page. My grandmother wrote here, "The true value of a recipe isn't in its ingredients, but in the hands that prepare it and the hearts that share it. The same is true for this town." She looked directly at the council members. "Ms. Sterling promises you prosperity. But prosperity without identity is just empty wealth. She wants to buy our recipes, our traditions, and convert them into her company's intellectual property. She wants us to become actors in a theme park of ourselves." She paused, letting the words resonate. "Our project may not offer the same immediate gains, but it offers something no money can buy: dignity, the opportunity to preserve who we are while creating a sustainable future." She continued speaking for 20 minutes, alternating between practical data on the cooperative's viability and emotional appeals about the value of authenticity. She presented letters of support from cultural organizations, commitments for government grants, testimonials from other towns that had followed similar models successfully. When she finished, the silence in the room was absolute. Then, one of the council members, Mr. Harrison, a man who had lived in town for 70 years, raised his hand. "I have a question for Ms. Sterling," he said. "What happens to the recipes you buy? Who will control them?" Sterling smiled confidently. "They'll be digitally preserved in our heritage database, accessible to chefs working in our facilities. But can the original families use them freely?" Sterling's smile faltered slightly. "There would be licensing agreements, of course, fair compensation for—" "So they wouldn't be ours anymore," Mr. Harrison interrupted. "They'd be yours." The murmur in the room grew. Other council members began asking more incisive questions. Sterling's armor began to show cracks. It was then that the room doors opened and Thaddeus entered, disheveled and clearly exhausted from the trip from Boston. Winifred felt her heart stop. He walked directly to the front, asking permission to speak. "I apologize for the interruption," he began, "but I need to make an important statement." All eyes were on him. "I've spent the past week in Boston trying to save my company from a financial crisis, and I succeeded, but at a cost. I had to sell several of my hotels, reduce operations, make painful compromises." He paused, his gaze meeting Winifred's. "In that process, I had time to think about why I do what I do. And I realized something. I've been building places that look like homes without truly understanding what a home is." He turned to the council. "A home isn't a beautiful building or a profitable business. It's a place where you belong, where your story matters, where people know you by name. And this town taught me that." He looked at Winifred again. "This woman taught me that, not through presentations or business plans, but through the way she bakes bread thinking about the people who will eat it, the way she preserves recipes because they honor those who came before." "What's your point?" one council member asked impatiently. "My point is that I'm withdrawing my investment from the project," Thaddeus said, and a collective gasp filled the room. Winifred felt the world stop. "Not because I don't believe in it," he continued, "but because I realize this project should never have depended on an outside investor. It should belong entirely to the community. And if that means it takes longer, that it's harder, that it requires more sacrifice, then so be it." He turned to Winifred, and in his eyes was something she hadn't seen before: complete vulnerability. "But if you'll allow me, I'd like to stay. Not as an investor, but as a resident. As someone who wants to be part of this community, who wants to learn its traditions, who wants to belong." The true value of a person isn't measured by what they can give, but by their willingness to give up everything to be part of something greater than themselves. The vote that followed wasn't unanimous, but it was clear: 4-3 in favor of the community project. Victoria Sterling accepted defeat with forced grace, gathered her team and left without looking back. When the room finally emptied, Winifred and Thaddeus remained alone among the disordered chairs and scattered documents. "Why did you do it?" she asked. "Why did you give up your investment?" "Because I learned something in Boston," he replied. "You can have all the money in the world and still feel empty if you don't have a place to belong. And I want to belong here, with you." With this community. Winifred felt tears burning in her eyes. I don't need you to give up anything for me. I didn't do it for you, he said gently. I did it for me, because for the first time in my life, I found something worth more than any investment, the possibility of a real home. But even as they embraced, both knew the real challenges were just beginning. Winning the vote was one thing. Making the project work without his main investment was something else entirely. And winter, with all its obstacles, was just beginning. The following 3 months were the most difficult Winifred had ever faced in her life. The cooperative they had formed faced obstacle after obstacle. The promised government grants were delayed indefinitely due to bureaucracy and political changes. Several businesses that had promised to contribute began to withdraw when economic reality prevailed over initial enthusiasm. Thaddeus, true to his word, remained in town. He sold his apartment in Boston, transferred what remained of his company to a modest office in town, and lived on a budget that was a fraction of what he had been accustomed to. But the transition wasn't easy. I don't know how to help without money, he confessed one evening, sitting in the bakery's back room while Winifred prepared dough for the next day. Everything I built was based on capital. Without it, I feel useless. You're not useless, Winifred replied, her hands covered in flour. You have knowledge, contacts, experience. That's worth more than money. But even as she said the words, she herself struggled with doubts. Had they done the right thing, rejecting Sterling's offer? Were they condemning the town to years of economic hardship for a romantic ideal? Winifred's bakery, ironically, was thriving. The festival had attracted national attention, and now she received orders from all over New England. But individual success wasn't enough when the collective project was faltering. One particularly cold December afternoon, the cooperative president, Mr. Harrison, called an emergency meeting. We can't continue like this, he said bluntly. We've spent almost all our funds on preliminary renovations. If we don't get additional investment in the next month, we'll have to abandon the project. The silence that followed was heavy with defeat. What if we look for private investors? Someone suggested. People who share our vision, but can bring capital. We've already tried, Beatrice replied, who had become the project's legal advisor. No one wants to invest in a cooperative model with long-term returns when more lucrative options are available. Winifred looked at Thaddeus, who had remained silent throughout the entire meeting. She could see the conflict on his face. He had contacts who could help, but he had promised not to interfere with external capital. That evening, as they walked on the deserted beach, he finally spoke. I have friends in the sustainable tourism sector, he said. People who invest specifically in projects that preserve cultural heritage. I could make some calls. You said you wouldn't invest more in the project. I didn't say I wouldn't help find investors, he corrected. There's a difference. Winifred stopped, watching the waves crash on the shore. What if it fails anyway? What if we drag the whole community into an epic failure? Then we'll fail having tried to preserve something that matters, Thaddeus replied. And that's more honorable than succeeding by selling our soul. But Winifred's doubts weren't limited to the project. They were also growing about her relationship with Thaddeus. Since he had given up his investment, there was a new tension between them. She felt guilty every time the bakery prospered while he struggled. He felt inadequate, accustomed to being the one who solved problems with money, and now unable to do so. You should consider going back to Boston, she said one evening. Rebuild your company from there. You don't have to stay here for me. I didn't stay for you, he replied, and the words hurt more than he intended. I stayed because I want to be here. But are you happy? The question floated between them like a ghost. Happiness isn't a permanent state, he said finally. It's something you build day by day, decision by decision. Sometimes love isn't enough to sustain a relationship. You also need timing, circumstances, and the strength to survive winter together before you can enjoy spring. Things reached a critical point on New Year's Eve. The cooperative had organized a modest celebration in the square, a final attempt to keep community morale high. But the atmosphere was forced, the joy artificial. Everyone knew that if a miracle didn't happen in January, the project would die. Winifred was serving pastries when she saw her mother speaking intensely with Thaddeus in a corner. His expression was grim, her mother's worried. When she approached, she heard, "It's not fair to her. She deserves someone who can give her stability, not more uncertainty." "Mom," Winifred interrupted, What are you talking about? Her mother looked between her and Thaddeus. I'm just being realistic, sweetheart. This man left his life in Boston for you. And for what? To live in a town where he has no real future, working on a project destined to fail. That's not your decision, Winifred said, but her mother's words had touched a nerve. Your father and I have been talking, her mother continued. We could help with the bakery if you wanted to expand. Sell the beach house. Use that money to secure a solid future for you. I won't let you sell the beach house. Then what will you do? Her mother raised her voice. Keep fighting for an impossible dream? Drag this man with you toward failure? Thaddeus finally spoke. With all due respect, ma'am, my decisions are mine. I don't feel dragged toward anything. But are you happy? Her mother asked, echoing the same question Winifred had asked. And this time Thaddeus hesitated just a second before answering. But that second was enough. Winifred walked away without waiting for the answer, blinded by tears she didn't want to shed in public. He found her on the beach an hour later, sitting on the cold sand, watching the stars. You didn't answer the question, she said without looking at him. Because happiness isn't the right word, he replied, sitting beside her. I'm in transition, learning who I am when I don't have the shield of money and success, and it's hard and sometimes terrifying, but it's also necessary. And am I part of that necessity, or just a distraction from your identity crisis? The words came out harsher than she intended, but she didn't retract them. You're the reason it's worth going through this, he said. But your mother is right about something. You deserve more than what I can offer you now. I didn't ask you to give up your life, Winifred turned toward him. I didn't ask you to stay here. I know, but I did it anyway, and now we both have to live with the consequences of that decision. They sat in silence, the space between them growing even though their shoulders almost touched. There are moments in a relationship where love isn't the question, but the strength to endure uncertainty together. When they finally returned to town, the church bells were ringing midnight. The new year had arrived, but it felt more like a funeral than a celebration, and both wondered silently whether their relationship would survive the cold of the winter that was just beginning. January brought not only cold, but a series of crises that threatened to destroy everything they had built. First, two of the cooperative's largest businesses withdrew, taking critical financial contributions with them. Then, an inspection revealed that one of the buildings they planned to renovate had structural damage, much more severe than anticipated, multiplying restoration costs. But the most devastating blow came when the bank rejected the collective loan the cooperative had requested, citing excessive financial risk and unproven business model. Mr. Harrison called another emergency meeting. This time, attendance was significantly lower than before. Many cooperative members had lost faith in the project. I propose we vote to dissolve the cooperative, Mr. Harrison said, his voice tired. We fought valiantly, but the reality is we don't have the resources to continue. The silence that followed was deafening. And then what? Winifred asked. We go back to where we were? We wait for Sterling to return with another offer? At least we'd have economic development, someone replied. At least our young people would have jobs. At the price of our identity. Identity doesn't pay bills, another member said with frustration. It doesn't feed families. It doesn't keep businesses open. The discussion became heated, voices rising, former allies now opposed. Winifred watched the chaos, feeling a mix of rage and helplessness. Thaddeus, seated in the back, finally stood. I have something to say. The room fell silent, all eyes turning toward him. When I arrived in this town months ago, I was a man who thought he could solve any problem with money. And in many ways I was right. Money can buy buildings, can hire experts, can create impressive structures. He walked to the front, his voice controlled but passionate. But I learned something here. Money can't buy what makes a place worthwhile. It can't buy the way Mr. Harrison knows the history of every building in this town. It can't buy the recipes grandmothers have perfected over decades. It can't buy the community that gathers every Monday in the square. He paused. So yes, maybe this project will fail financially. Maybe we can't compete with developers who have deeper pockets. But even if we fail, we'll have proven something important, that there are people willing to fight to preserve what matters, even when it's easier to sell it to the highest bidder. Nice words, someone said cynically, but they don't solve our real problems. You're right, Thaddeus admitted. That's why I've made a decision. He looked directly at Winifred, and she could see determination mixed with something that looked like fear. "I'm going to sell my last operating hotel. It's in Portland, my first successful project. I've been putting it off because it has sentimental value, but I've received generous offers from buyers who will preserve its character." Winifred felt her heart stop. "No," she whispered. "With that money," he continued, ignoring her protest, "I can cover the necessary structural renovations and keep the project viable for at least another year, enough time for the cooperative to prove its viability and attract other investors." "You can't do that," Winifred said louder. "That hotel is your legacy. It's what you built from nothing. And this town could be my home," he replied. "What's worth more?" The question resonated in the uncomfortable silence. "Mr. Harrison finally spoke. "It's a generous offer, but we need time to consider it. We'll vote in 2 days." When the meeting ended, Winifred confronted Thaddeus on the empty street, her breath visible in the cold night air. "How dare you!" she spat, tears of rage streaming down her cheeks. "How dare you sacrifice everything you've built for this?" "For you," he corrected. "For us. For the possibility of something real. I didn't ask you to give up your life." "No, but I chose to do it," his voice was firm. "And every time you need to remind yourself you didn't ask for this, it tells me you still don't believe my decision was genuine." The words hit her like a slap. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you're still waiting for me to abandon you," Thaddeus said. "Like he did. You're still waiting for me to prove I'm no different, that I'll eventually leave when things get tough. And can you blame me?" Winifred raised her voice. "After everything I've lost?" "No, I can't," he replied softly. "But I also can't keep proving myself if it'll never be enough." The silence that followed was dense with unspoken pain. "Maybe your mother was right," Thaddeus continued. "Maybe you deserve someone who can give you the stability I can't offer now. Someone who doesn't remind you of your losses every time you look at him." "Don't put this on me," Winifred said. "You were the one who decided to stay. You were the one who decided to invest everything in this place." "Because I love you," the words exploded from him. "Because I fell in love with a woman who bakes bread with her grandmother's hands, who preserves recipes like they're sacred, who fights for her community, even when it would be easier to give up." Tears flowed freely down Winifred's face now. "But loving isn't enough," she whispered. "Not when everything else is falling apart. The deepest love often arrives at the most inopportune moment, when we're too broken to receive it fully, too scared to trust it completely." That night, Winifred couldn't sleep. She lay awake in her apartment, her grandmother's notebook open before her. She turned the pages, reading the annotations in the margins, the small stories each generation had added. She found an entry from her great-grandmother, dated 1943, during the dark years of the war. "Today I had to choose between selling the imperial apple pie recipe or keeping the oven open. I chose the oven. Because recipes are memories, but baking is an act of hope. Every loaf I make says, I believe tomorrow will come. I believe it's worth feeding the future." Winifred closed the notebook, new tears welling. Her great-grandmother had faced unimaginable loss, war, hunger, poverty. And yet she had chosen hope. She had chosen to believe in tomorrow. Could Winifred do less? But the answer didn't come that night or the next day. It came in the most unexpected way, through a phone call from an unknown number. "Miss Winifred?" said a female voice. "My name is Eleanor Wright. I'm director of the Foundation for American Culinary Heritage." Winifred listened as Eleanor explained she had read about their project in several press articles. "What you're doing is exactly the type of initiative our foundation was created to support," Eleanor continued. "I'd like to come visit you and discuss possibilities for funding and institutional support." It was the first good news in weeks, but even as Winifred thanked her and accepted a meeting, she wondered, would it be enough to save the project? And more importantly, was it enough to save what was between her and Thaddeus? Eleanor Wright arrived in town a week later, accompanied by 2 evaluators and a documentarian. For 3 days, they toured every corner, spoke with residents, tasted pastries, examined historical documents. Winifred guided them personally, showing them not just the physical spaces but the people who made them special. The 85-year-old grandmother who still made pies every Sunday, the fisherman who knew seafood recipes dating back to colonial times, the children at the local school who had begun learning traditional baking as part of their curriculum. Thaddeus stayed in the background, contributing only when directly asked. Since their confrontation, they had spoken little, the distance between them growing like a chasm neither knew how to cross. On the final evening of the visit, Eleanor called a meeting at the town hall. "I've seen many cultural preservation projects," she began, "but few with the level of community commitment you have here. What you've built isn't just a business plan, it's a movement." She paused, letting anticipation build. "The foundation is prepared to offer an implementation grant of $300,000, plus technical support and connections with other cultural heritage organizations at the national level." The silence in the room exploded into celebration. People embracing, tears of relief and joy, voices rising in gratitude. But Eleanor raised a hand. "There are conditions. The project must remain a genuine cooperative, with community participation in all important decisions. It must prioritize preservation over profit, and it needs stable leadership for at least the next 5 years." She looked directly at Winifred. "I've done my research. I know you've been the driving force behind this. The foundation needs to know you'll commit long-term." All eyes turned to Winifred. She felt the weight of their expectations, the hope in their faces. "I commit," she said, her voice firm despite nervousness. "This is my home. These are my roots. I'm not going anywhere." The celebration extended late into the night, but Winifred noticed Thaddeus had left early, without even saying goodbye. She found him the next day at the Bradford mansion, packing documents into boxes. "What are you doing?" He turned, surprise crossing his face before he could hide it. "Organizing. Now that the foundation is involved, they'll need access to all planning documents and—" "Why did you leave last night?" she interrupted. Thaddeus dropped the papers he was holding. "Because it was your moment, your victory. I didn't want to overshadow it." "Overshadow it? You were part of this as much as me." "No," he shook his head. "This was yours from the beginning. I was just trying to find my place, and I think it's time to admit maybe there isn't one." Winifred felt something break in her chest. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you were right. Maybe I sacrificed too much. Maybe I tried to force a connection that wasn't meant to be." "Don't say that." "Why not?" His voice rose. "We've been dancing around this for weeks. The tension, the doubts, the constant fighting. Maybe it's time to be honest." "Then let's be honest." Winifred took a step toward him. "I'm terrified. Terrified of trusting you. Terrified you'll leave me. Terrified this is all too good to be true." "And I'm lost," Thaddeus admitted. "I spent my entire adult life knowing exactly who I was. A successful businessman. Someone who solved problems with money. Without that, I don't know who I'm supposed to be." True intimacy doesn't come from sharing strengths, but from exposing vulnerabilities and trusting the other won't use them as weapons. They stood looking at each other, two broken people trying to discover if their broken pieces could fit together. "My grandmother used to say something," Winifred spoke softly. "She said true love isn't finding someone perfect, but finding someone with whom it's worth being imperfect." "Sounds wise." "She was wise," Winifred smiled weakly. "She also said making dough requires patience. You can't rush the rising. You can't force it to rise faster just because you're in a hurry." "Are you comparing our relationship to bread dough?" "I'm saying maybe we've both been trying to force something that needs time," she replied. "Time to heal, time to find our footing, time to learn who we are without the identities that defined us before." Thaddeus nodded slowly. "And in the meantime?" "In the meantime, we're honest. About the fears, about the doubts, about the hard days. We don't pretend everything is perfect." "I'm not good with vulnerability," he admitted. "And I'm not good at trusting," she replied. "So we'll both have to learn." She took another step toward him, closing the distance between them. "But I want to try. I want to try to build something real with you, even if it's scary, even if I don't know how it'll end." Thaddeus looked at her for a long moment, and in his eyes she saw all the battles he had fought, all the losses he had endured, all the walls he had built to protect himself. And then, slowly and deliberately, he began to lower them. "Me too," he said simply. They embraced in the middle of the mansion under renovation, surrounded by construction dust and future promises, two imperfect people choosing to be imperfect together. That was the real turning point. Not the foundation's grant, Not the project's success, but two people choosing vulnerability over protection, hope over fear. Spring came early that year, bringing renewal in more ways than one. With support from the Foundation for American Culinary Heritage, the project took on new life. Structural renovations began in earnest. An artisanal baking school opened in the building that once housed an abandoned factory. Young people from town and neighboring regions enrolled to learn traditional techniques while adding modern innovations. Winifred became the principal director, a role that both terrified and excited her equally. She spent her days between the bakery, the school, and endless meetings with architects, accountants, and cultural officials. Thaddeus found his own niche, not as an investor, but as project coordinator. His experience in management and development proved invaluable, but now he worked as an equal collaborator instead of the distant benefactor. They also began couples therapy, something Thaddeus had suggested and Winifred had accepted with initial skepticism. "I thought therapy was for marriages on the brink of divorce," she had said, "or for people who want to make sure they never get to that point," he had replied. In weekly sessions with a psychologist in the nearby city, they learned to communicate without defenses, to express needs without guilt, to listen without preparing responses. "Your fear of abandonment won't disappear overnight," the therapist told them during one session. "And neither will your need to prove your worth through external success, but you can learn to recognize these patterns when they emerge and choose to respond differently." One April afternoon, Winifred was teaching a class at the baking school when Thaddeus appeared at the door holding a manila envelope. "Can I interrupt?" She nodded, intrigued. "I want to show you something," he said, unfolding documents on the table among the balls of dough. "These are the papers from the sale of my hotel in Portland." Winifred felt a familiar pang of guilt. "Thaddeus." "Wait," he interrupted. "I want you to see this." He pointed to a clause in the contract. "The buyers have agreed to hire all existing staff and maintain the hotel's name and character. They've also established a scholarship fund for sustainable tourism students in my name." She read the words, feeling tears prick in her eyes. "That's beautiful. And this," he continued, showing another document, "is the money from the sale. 50% goes to the cooperative as promised, but the other 50%, I want us to invest it together in something new." "What do you have in mind?" "A microloan program for young entrepreneurs in town. People who want to start businesses that honor traditions but carry them into the future, like you did with your bakery." Winifred felt overwhelming emotion. "Why?" "Because you taught me that true legacy isn't what you build for yourself, but what you make possible for others," he replied, "and I want us to build that legacy together. Second chances don't come to give us what we lost, but to teach us to build something better with the lessons learned." In May, the first cohort of students graduated from the baking school. The ceremony was held in the main square, decorated with beach roses and brightly colored flags. The town's grandmothers prepared a banquet table that extended across the entire square, each dish representing a different tradition, a different story. Winifred gave the graduation speech, standing before the 30 students who represented the project's hope. "My grandmother used to say that baking is an act of faith," she began. "Faith that the yeast will rise, faith that the ingredients will combine correctly, faith that someone will value what you've created." She paused, looking at the young faces full of expectation. "But I've learned that life also requires that kind of faith. Faith that endings can become beginnings. Faith that losses can teach us what we truly value. Faith that we're not alone in our struggles." Her gaze found Thaddeus's in the crowd. "You've learned more than baking techniques here. You've learned about community, about tradition, about the courage to preserve what matters while innovating for the future. Carry that with you wherever you go." When she finished, the ovation was deafening. That evening, as the celebration continued in the square, Winifred and Thaddeus walked to the beach seeking a moment of quiet. The Atlantic glistened under the full moon's light, waves whispering against the sand. "Do you remember the first time you saw me?" Winifred asked. "At the chapel on my wedding day. How could I forget? What did you think in that moment?" Thaddeus considered the question carefully. "I thought I had never seen someone so broken and so dignified at the same time. I thought that if I could someday be half as strong as that woman holding her bouquet of peonies, I would have accomplished something important." Winifred felt warm tears on her cheeks. "I didn't feel strong. I felt broken. Strength isn't the absence of breaking, he said. It's the choice to stay standing even when you're in pieces. They sat on the sand, shoulders touching, watching the horizon where sky met sea. I've been thinking, Winifred said after a long silence, about the future, about us. And I think I'm finally ready to stop waiting for you to abandon me. Not because you have all the answers or because you can promise you'll never hurt me, but because I've learned that surviving the worst day of my life means I can survive anything. She turned toward him. But more than that, I've learned I don't just want to survive. I want to live, I want to build, I want to love, without holding back parts of myself as insurance against pain. Thaddeus took her hand. I'm ready too. Ready to stop proving my worth through external success. Ready to believe I'm enough just being myself, with all my insecurities and fears. They kissed under the moon, a kiss that tasted of salt and promises, of endings and beginnings, of all the battles fought and all the victories still to come. So what's next? She asked when they finally parted. Next is that we build a life together day by day, decision by decision, he replied. Not perfect, but ours. And for the first time in months, the future didn't seem terrifying but full of possibilities. It was a June afternoon, while Winifred was covered in flour and frustration after an entire batch of pies had been ruined due to a faulty oven, that Thaddeus decided it was the perfect moment. You must be joking, she said, when she saw him kneeling in the middle of the messy kitchen. I'm covered in dough, the oven is broken. I just lost 2 hours of work. Exactly, he interrupted. Because if I ask you when everything is perfect, when you're beautiful and composed and everything is going well, you might think I only love you in the good times. She stood frozen, the rolling pin still in her hand. But I love you especially in moments like this, Thaddeus continued, when you're frustrated and disheveled and have no patience for romantic nonsense. Because that's how I know it's real. I love you on the hard days, in the imperfect moments, when you're being completely human and not an edited version of yourself. He pulled out a small box from his pocket. Not elegant velvet, but an old tin candy box Winifred recognized from her grandmother's collection. I found this at the town flea market, he explained, and I thought it was perfect because it's old and has history, like the things we value. He opened the box. Inside was a ring that clearly wasn't new, with a worn silver band and a small but brilliant stone. It belonged to my mother, he said. It's the only thing I have from her. They gave it to me when I left the last foster home, along with a birth certificate and some blurry photographs. Winifred felt tears welling. I never had a real home, Thaddeus continued, his voice breaking slightly. But you taught me that home isn't a place, but people who choose you again and again on good days and bad. He paused, looking at her directly. So, Winifred, covered in flour and frustration, and completely imperfect. Will you marry me? Will you let me choose you every day, in perfect and imperfect moments for the rest of our lives? She stood looking at him, this man who had given up an empire to find belonging, who had learned to be vulnerable, who loved her not despite her brokenness, but including all of it. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes, 1,000 times yes. He stood and spun her around, and it didn't matter that they were covering everything in flour, that the ring was slightly crooked on her finger, that this wasn't the cinematic moment movies promise. It was better. It was real. Life's best moments rarely come wrapped in perfection, but in the beautiful chaos of two people choosing each other amid everyday imperfection. But even as they celebrated, they knew one final obstacle awaited them, the community vote on the project's future. Though the cooperative had been successful in its initial stages, not everyone in town was convinced. A significant group led by younger business people argued they needed to expand more aggressively, attract major hotel chains, modernize without so much emphasis on preservation. Tension reached its peak at the final meeting before the vote, when Marcus, a 30-year-old entrepreneur who had returned to town after studying in New York, presented a counter-proposal. I respect what you've accomplished, he said, but let's be honest. The current model is too slow, too conservative. If we truly want economic prosperity, we need to be more aggressive. He showed projections promising double the jobs, triple the tourism revenue. The only cost, Marcus continued, is that some preservation restrictions would need to be loosened. Some old buildings that aren't structurally sound should be replaced with modern replicas. The murmur in the room grew. Winifred felt her heart racing. Replicas, she repeated. So you're suggesting we destroy real historic buildings and replace them with fakes? I'm suggesting we be pragmatic, Marcus replied. A tourist can't tell the difference between a 17th century wall and a well-made replica, but they can notice the difference between a prosperous town and one stuck in the past. Thaddeus stood. With all due respect, that's exactly the kind of thinking that turns unique places into generic theme parks. There are hundreds of modernized towns in America that all look exactly the same because they sacrificed authenticity for convenience. And how many of them have 20% unemployment rates? Marcus countered. How many are losing their young people because there are no opportunities? It was a low blow and everyone knew it. Youth emigration was a real problem in town. Winifred took a deep breath. She had learned in recent months that emotion without strategy was useless. She needed to appeal to both hearts and minds. Marcus is right about something, she said, surprising everyone. We need to create opportunities for our young people. We need economic prosperity. She paused, letting her words settle. But the question is, what kind of prosperity do we want? Do we want to be another interchangeable tourist destination, or do we want to be a place people visit precisely because they can't find it anywhere else? She pointed toward the town hall windows, toward the town extending outside. Each of these buildings has a story. The estate where the peace treaty was signed in 1814, the mansion where the poet Longfellow wrote his most famous sonnets, the bakery where my grandmother perfected recipes that have been in my family since before America was America. Her voice strengthened. If we replace them with replicas, no matter how well made, we're saying those stories don't matter, that the past is just decoration, not foundation, and once we start down that path, where do we stop? Mr. Harrison raised his hand. I have a question for both of you. Marcus, you promised double the jobs. Winifred, what can you promise? It was the moment of truth. Winifred looked at Thaddeus, who nodded with confidence. I can't promise numbers as big as Marcus, she admitted, but I can promise jobs that come with dignity, with connection to community, with the satisfaction of preserving something important. Thaddeus added, and I can show you real data. We've worked with the foundation and analyzed similar towns that followed our model. In 5 years, average economic growth is 40%, with youth retention rates 3 times higher than towns that modernized aggressively. Why? Someone asked. Because today's young people don't just want jobs, Winifred replied. They want meaning. They want to be part of something that matters. The baking school has a 2-year waiting list. Young people from all over New England want to learn here, live here, because we represent something real in an increasingly artificial world. Beatrice, her sister, stood. I was one of those young people who left for the city. I studied law in Boston, had offers from prestigious firms, but I came back here because I saw something I couldn't find in any Boston skyscraper. Purpose. Her voice resonated in the silence. And I'm not alone. 6 of my classmates have asked about opportunities here, not because we pay more, but because we offer something money can't buy. The debate continued for hours. Passionate arguments from both sides, valid concerns, competing dreams for the town's future. Finally, Mr. Harrison called for silence. We'll vote in 2 days, but before that, I want each of you to do something. Walk through town. Touch the walls that are 300 years old. Think about the stories those stones could tell, and then decide, what do we want to be? That night, Winifred couldn't sleep. Too many thoughts, too many worries. She rose before dawn and walked to the bakery, turned on the ovens, began preparing dough. Baking had always been her meditation, her way of processing emotions too large for words. Thaddeus found her there 2 hours later, surrounded by trays of sugar roses, each meticulously hand-formed. You didn't sleep. I couldn't, she admitted. I keep thinking, what if we're wrong? What if our romantic vision of the past is condemning the town to poverty? Do you honestly believe that? She stopped, hands covered in powdered sugar. No, but I'm afraid we're asking too much sacrifice from people. Thaddeus approached, picked up one of the sugar flowers she had created. Do you know why these are beautiful? Why? Because they're imperfect. Every petal is slightly different. No flower is exactly like another. An industrial mold could produce 1,000 identical ones in an hour, but no one would remember them. He gently placed the flower back. The same is true for this town. We can be efficient and interchangeable, or we can be unique and unforgettable. We can't be both. Authenticity always requires more effort than imitation, more time than mass production, more courage than convenience. But it's the only thing that, once lost, can never truly be recovered. The day of the vote, the square was packed. More than 500 people had come, including residents who had moved away years ago, but still considered the town their home. The vote was public, each person depositing their ballot in a transparent urn at the center of the square. Winifred watched with her heart in her throat as, one by one, residents made their choice. Some voted with confidence, others with visible conflict. She saw mothers worried about their children's future. She saw elderly people clinging to memories. She saw young people trying to imagine what kind of place they wanted to live in. The count took more than an hour. When Mr. Harrison finally stepped up to the podium to announce the results, the silence was absolute. The vote has been 322 in favor of the preservation model with sustainable development. 178 in favor of accelerated modernization. An explosion of celebration and relief filled the square. Winifred felt her legs give way, and Thaddeus held her up, but Mr. Harrison raised a hand, asking for silence. However, I want to say something to those who voted differently. Your concern for economic prosperity is valid. Your fears for the future are legitimate. This victory doesn't mean we ignore those concerns. He looked directly at Marcus. It means we'll find ways to address them that don't require sacrificing our soul in the process, and we'll need everyone working together to get there. Marcus nodded slowly, and though disappointment was clear on his face, there was also something like respect. That evening, as the celebration continued in the square with music and food, Winifred found herself standing in the same spot where she had been months before during the culinary festival. But now, looking at the crowd, she saw something different. Not just a town, but a community that had collectively chosen its future, that had decided some things were worth more than the easier road. Thaddeus appeared at her side, 2 glasses of wine in his hands. "We did it," he said. "We did it," she repeated, but her voice carried a note of wonder, as if she still couldn't quite believe it was real. "You know what's most extraordinary?" Thaddeus asked. "A year ago you were standing in a chapel waiting for a man who never appeared. And now you're here, having saved an entire town." "I didn't save it alone." "No," he agreed. "But you were the spark, the one who refused to give up, even when it would have been easier." Winifred thought about the woman she had been that day at the chapel. Broken, humiliated, feeling like her life was over. And then she thought about the woman she was now. Strong, not because she never broke, but because she had learned to rebuild herself. "I think my grandmother was right," she said softly. "About what?" "About everything. About how endings are just beginnings in disguise. About how true value is never in ease but in effort. About how love, true love, is a choice we make every day." She turned to Thaddeus, this man who had given up an empire to find a home, who had loved her on her worst days and celebrated on the best. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" "For showing up, for staying, for loving me even when I didn't know how to love myself." He smiled, and in his eyes was all the tenderness in the world. "The pleasure was mine." And as music floated over the square and stars shone above the Atlantic, 2 people who had been broken discovered their pieces fit together perfectly, creating something more beautiful than either could have been alone. 18 months later, on a September morning that smelled of beach roses and possibilities, Winifred woke in the room she now shared with Thaddeus in the apartment above the bakery. Sunlight filtered through linen curtains, casting golden patterns on walls decorated with photographs. The baking school's inauguration, the UNESCO ceremony designating the town as intangible culinary heritage, the intimate wedding in the chapel where it all began. That wedding had been perfect in its imperfection. Not 200 guests, but 50 people who truly mattered. Not an elaborate dress, but a simple cotton dress her mother had sewn. Not an orchestra, but a neighbor's guitar playing traditional New England folk songs. And this time the groom had appeared. More than that, he had walked to the altar with eyes full of tears, had spoken vows he wrote himself about belonging and home, had held her hands as if they were the most precious thing in the world. Winifred rose carefully, leaving Thaddeus sleeping, and went down to the bakery. Even before opening, it was her morning ritual. Turn on the ovens, prepare the first dough of the day, connect with the craft that had been her anchor through all the storms. But today there was something special. Today was the anniversary of that terrible and transformative day at the chapel. 2 years since her life, as she knew it, had ended. 2 years since she had begun the journey that brought her here. As she thought about everything that had changed. The bakery was now part of a culinary complex, attracting visitors from across the country. The baking school had graduated 3 cohorts, with students opening their own businesses in neighboring towns, carrying the traditions learned here to new communities. The microloan program she and Thaddeus had founded had helped launch 17 local businesses, from a craft brewery using 19th century recipes to a pottery workshop recreating colonial techniques. But most importantly, they had created something that couldn't be measured in numbers, a sense of possibility. The belief that preserving the past and building the future weren't opposing goals, but complementary ones. The bell above the door chimed, interrupting her thoughts. It was too early for customers, but when she turned, she saw her mother entering with a box in her hands. "I thought you'd be here," her mother said, smiling. "I'm always here at this hour, Mum." "I know." Her mother placed the box on the counter. "That's why I brought this." Winifred opened the box curiously. Inside was a notebook, clearly old, with yellowed pages and a worn leather cover. "What is it?" "It's your great-grandmother's notebook," her mother replied. "The one she used before the one your grandmother gave you. I found it cleaning the attic of the family house." With trembling hands, Winifred opened the notebook. The first pages were recipes, written in the elaborate handwriting of the early 20th century. But toward the end, she found diary pages, personal reflections written between recipes. One entry in particular caught her attention, dated 1918. "Today my fiancé left me for another woman a week before our wedding. The whole town talks of my humiliation. My mother says I'll never find another man who will love me. But as I bake this bread, as my hands work the dough my mother taught me to make, I feel something stronger than pain. I feel continuity. I feel I'm part of something bigger than this moment of suffering. And I know, in a way I can't explain, this isn't my end, but my beginning." Winifred felt tears streaming down her cheeks. "She was abandoned too," she whispered. "Yes," her mother approached, embracing her. "And she met your great-grandfather 2 years later. He was a widower with 2 children. She was the abandoned bride no one wanted. But they built a beautiful life together. They had 6 children, including your grandmother. And she always said her first cancelled wedding was the best thing that ever happened to her. The stories of women in our family repeat not as tragedies, but as promises, that we can survive what seems to destroy us, that we can flourish where others expect us to wither." Thaddeus came down an hour later, drawn by the aroma of fresh-baked bread. He found Winifred and her mother sitting in the back, surrounded by old notebooks and vintage photographs, tracing lines of resilience through generations. "Good morning," he said, kissing the top of Winifred's head. "Good morning," she replied, looking up with eyes bright with happy tears. "My great-grandmother was also abandoned at the altar." She told him the story while her mother made coffee, and when she finished, Thaddeus held the old notebook with reverence. "So it's genetic," he joked gently, "this ability to turn endings into beginnings. Or maybe," Winifred's mother said, "it's simply that strong women raise strong women, and when those women face moments that could break them, they choose instead to become something new." The rest of the day passed in a mix of work and intimate celebration. Winifred served customers, supervised a class at the school, met with architects working on the next renovation phase. Thaddeus handled paperwork for the cooperative, made calls to potential investors for new projects, helped a young entrepreneur finalize their microloan application. But when the sun began to set, they found themselves again on the beach, the same place where they'd had so many important conversations, so many moments of truth. "You know what I've been thinking?" Winifred asked as they walked along the shore. "What?" "About that day at the chapel. How ashamed I felt, how humiliated. Like everyone was looking at me and seeing only my failure." She paused, picking up a particularly beautiful shell. "But now I realize they weren't looking at me as a failure. They were looking at me with compassion, with empathy, because everyone in that chapel had faced their own version of that moment, not necessarily a cancelled wedding, but moments when they thought their world was ending. And they survived," Thaddeus added. And they survived, she repeated. Like I survived. Like we'll survive whatever comes. Thaddeus stopped, taking both her hands. I have something for you, he said. Another gift? You've already given me enough. This one is different. From his pocket, he pulled out an antique key. It's to the Bradford mansion. She took it, confused. I already have access to the mansion. Not as a visitor, he corrected. As owner. I've transferred the property to your name. Winifred felt the world stop. What? I can't accept. It's already done, he interrupted. And before you protest, hear my reasoning. He took a deep breath. When I bought that building, I thought it would be the anchor of my empire in this town. An investment. An asset. But you taught me that buildings aren't just properties but responsibilities, stories we must preserve for future generations. He closed her hands around the key. And I can't think of anyone better to be the guardian of that story than you. Someone who understands that preserving the past isn't living in it, but honoring it while building the future. Thaddeus. Besides, he added with a smile, technically it's ours. We're married. I just put your name because I wanted you to know I trust you completely, that I don't need to control everything, that I can share not just my life but my legacy. Winifred embraced him, the key pressed between their hearts. Thank you, she whispered. Not just for this, for everything, for showing up when I needed it most, even when I didn't know I needed it. The pleasure was mine, he replied, echoing the words he'd said months before. It always will be. As the sun set over the Atlantic, painting the sky orange and purple and pink, they walked toward town. But before arriving, Winifred stopped one last time, looking at the chapel in the distance. You know, she said thoughtfully, I used to avoid passing by there. It reminded me too much of that horrible day. And now I see something different, she replied. I see the place where my old life ended so this new one could begin, and I'm grateful for both. For the woman I was, who brought me here, and for the woman I am now, who learned that the end of a story can be the prologue to something much more beautiful. True transformation doesn't come from avoiding pain, but from going through it and discovering that on the other side awaits a version of ourselves we didn't know we could be. That evening they organized a small dinner at the bakery with their close circle, Winifred's parents, Beatrice, Mr. Harrison, the minister who had been there from the beginning, some of the cooperative's most devoted members. It wasn't a celebration of anything specific, just a gathering of people who had become family, who had fought together for something that mattered. During dessert, a modern reinterpretation of the imperial apple pie, grandmother's recipe reimagined with contemporary techniques, Mr. Harrison stood. I want to make a toast, he said, raising his glass. To Winifred, who taught us that strength isn't never falling but always rising. To Thaddeus, the minister added, who taught us that home isn't where you were born, but where you choose to belong. To all of us, Beatrice said, who chose the difficult path because it was the right one. And finally Winifred stood, her voice clear and firm. To my grandmother, she said, and all the women who came before me, who taught me through their recipes and their stories that we're stronger than we believe, more resilient than we imagine, and that love, true love, is always worth waiting for. The glasses clinked, the sound resonating in the space filled with laughter and warmth, and the certainty that whatever challenges the future brought, they would face everything together. Later, when everyone had gone and the bakery was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator, Winifred and Thaddeus climbed to their apartment. They stood on the balcony, watching the town extending below, lights twinkling in windows like earthbound stars. Happy? Thaddeus asked. Winifred considered the question. Happiness was such a simple word for something so complex. What she felt was bigger than happiness. It was wholeness. It was peace. It was the deep satisfaction of knowing she had found not just love, but purpose. Not just a partner, but a true home. Yes, she finally replied, more than I thought possible. He kissed her gently, and in that kiss was all the promise of the future they would build together, the challenges they would face, the joys they would share, the children who might someday bake in that same bakery, learning the recipes that had passed through generations. Because this wasn't just their story. It was the story of all the women in her family who had baked bread in moments of despair and discovered hope in the dough. It was the story of a town that chose authenticity over convenience. It was the story of two broken people who discovered their fractures fit together perfectly, creating something more beautiful than any intact perfection could have been. And when Winifred finally fell asleep that night, curled against Thaddeus while the moon shone over the Atlantic, she dreamed not of the past, but of the future, with grandchildren learning to make sugar roses, with her grandmother's notebook being passed to new hands, with the town flourishing, preserving its soul while embracing tomorrow. She dreamed of love that lasts not because it's easy, but because it's true, with homes built not of walls, but of daily choices to stay, to fight, to grow together. And she dreamed of endings that always are just beginnings in disguise. Because the most beautiful story is never about finding perfect love, but about two imperfect people who choose to love each other perfectly through all of life's imperfections. The town by the sea continued its timeless rhythm, waves breaking on the shore, the scent of beach roses floating in the breeze, lights twinkling in windows where families gathered. And in a small bakery on Harbour Street, where generations of women had kneaded bread and dreams in equal measure, the legacy continued. Not because nothing had changed, but because everything that mattered had been preserved. The capacity to love after loss, the strength to rise after falling, and the wisdom to recognize that sometimes the best chapter of our lives begins exactly when we think the story is over.